You thought you knew them, didn't you? You really thought you had them figured out. Thought their smiles meant something. Thought their public face was the real face. Thought the version they performed for the cameras was the version that exists when the lights go off and the doors lock and the masks come down. Let me stop you right there, because what I'm about to tell you is going to shatter every assumption you've been carrying around like precious cargo. The people you've been watching, the ones you've been trusting, the ones you've been defending in comment sections and group chats. They've been living a completely different life behind closed doors, and the evidence just leaked. Not rumors, not speculation, not some conspiracy theory cooked up in someone's basement. Actual, documented proof of what they've really been doing when nobody's supposed to be watching. And I'm telling you right now, once you see what I'm about to show you, you will never look at them the same way again, because here's what they never wanted you to know. Here's the part they spent millions trying to bury. The part they threatened lawyers over. The part that kept them up at night, sweating through expensive sheets, wondering if today would be the day it all came out. They built an entire empire on a foundation of carefully constructed lies. And every single brick in that empire was mortared with manipulation. You saw the charity events, the inspirational speeches, the perfectly timed social media posts about mental health and kindness and treating people with respect. And you believed it, because why wouldn't you? Because we want to believe that successful people got there through merit, through hard work, through being fundamentally good. But behind those closed doors, behind the security systems and the NDAs and the layers of handlers and publicists, they were doing things that would make your stomach turn. They were calculating, strategizing, destroying people's lives like it was a game. Like human beings were just pieces on a board that existed solely for their entertainment and profit. The leaked documents tell a story that's so much darker than anyone suspected. A story of systematic manipulation that goes back years, maybe decades. We're talking about recorded conversations where they laugh about the people who respect them, where they mock the very fans who made them rich, where they plot ways to extract more money, more attention, more power from people who genuinely believed in them. We're talking about emails that lay out strategies for ruining competitors, for silencing critics, for manufacturing public personas that have absolutely nothing to do with who they actually are. These aren't isolated incidents. This isn't one bad day caught on a hot mic. This is a pattern, a philosophy, a way of operating in the world that treats other human beings as resources to be exploited and discarded. Ask yourself, are you really going to read more of the same? And the most twisted part, the part that's going to make you question everything, is how good they got at hiding it. How seamlessly they moved between the public saint and the private monster. You're gonna want to look away from what's coming. You're gonna want to close this video and pretend you never clicked. You're gonna want to go back to the comfortable ignorance of thinking the world is basically fair and people are basically good. But you can't unknow what you're about to know. You can't unsee what you're about to see. And honestly, you shouldn't want to. Because living in the truth, even when it's ugly, even when it's painful, is always better than living in a lie. They've been counting on your willingness to look away, counting on your desire to believe the best in people, counting on you being too busy or too tired or too trusting to ask the hard questions. Well, someone finally asked those questions, and the answers just destroyed everything they spent years building. The empire is crumbling, and you're about to find out why. So buckle up, Turn off your notifications and prepare yourself for the kind of revelation that changes how you see not just them, but everyone. Because once you understand how they operated, once you see the machinery behind the illusion, you'll start recognizing the same patterns everywhere you look. This isn't just about one person or one scandal. This is about the architecture of deception that exists at the highest levels of success and influence. This is about what happens when someone gets so powerful they forget they're still human, still accountable, still capable of being exposed. They thought they were untouchable, and for a long time they were right. But every empire built on lies eventually collapses under the weight of its own corruption. That collapse just started, and you're witnessing it in real time. Let's go deeper. Here's what the leaked footage shows. Here's what thousands of hours of secretly recorded material has confirmed beyond any shadow of doubt. They weren't just different behind closed doors, they were the complete opposite of everything they claimed to be. While they were posting about treating people with kindness, they were screaming at assistants for bringing the wrong coffee, firing people on the spot for making eye contact, creating a culture of fear so intense that employees would have panic attacks before meetings. While they were giving interviews about mental health awareness, they were actively destroying the mental health of everyone around them, gaslighting staff members into thinking their completely reasonable concerns were signs of weakness, threatening careers if anyone dared to push back against unreasonable demands. The person you saw on stage, the one with the inspiring message and the warm smile, that person doesn't exist. That person was a character, a performance, a carefully crafted illusion designed to extract maximum profit from your belief. The recordings are brutal in their honesty. You can hear the real voice, the one they use when they think nobody's listening, when they're surrounded only by people too scared or too complicit to object. You can hear them plotting revenge against people who criticize them, brainstorming ways to destroy reputations, laughing about fans who spent their last dollars on merchandise, strategizing about how to manipulate narratives and control media coverage. These aren't taken out of context. These aren't misunderstandings. These are clear, undeniable admissions of behavior that contradicts everything they've ever said publicly. They talked about loyalty while betraying everyone who trusted them. They preached authenticity while being the most inauthentic person in the room. They sold you a dream while privately mocking you for buying it. And the sickest part is how casual it all was. How normalized this level of cruelty and manipulation had become in their inner circle. The leaked emails paint an even darker picture, showing a systematic approach to building and maintaining power through fear and control. We're seeing evidence of them paying people to spread false information about competitors, hiring investigators to dig up dirt on critics, using legal threats to silence victims of their behavior. They are using PayPal as a taxi admin to tap on all their payments, or like a legal public squad to gut them out. We're seeing conversations where they discuss which lies to tell to which audiences, how to craft statements that sound good but mean nothing, how to apologize without admitting fault, how to appear humble while being completely consumed by ego. They studied manipulation like it was a science. They perfected the art of saying exactly what people wanted to hear while doing exactly what benefited them most. Every public appearance was calculated. Every social media post was focus tested. Every moment of apparent vulnerability was a strategic move designed to deepen your parasocial connection, while they extracted more from your wallet and your attention. But it goes even deeper than professional manipulation. The leaks reveal personal cruelty that's genuinely shocking. We're talking about them mocking people's appearances behind their backs, making cruel jokes about people's trauma, treating relationships as transactions where every interaction was evaluated based on what they could gain. Former friends describe a pattern of using people until they were no longer useful, then discarding them without a second thought, of making promises with no intention of keeping them, of lying so reflexively that truth became optional. Partners describe emotional abuse disguised as honesty, financial control disguised as generosity, isolation disguised as protection. They created an environment where everyone around them was either a tool to be used or an obstacle to be removed, where human connection was reduced to a calculation of value, where love and loyalty were just words to deploy when convenient. The most damning evidence comes from people who worked closest to them, the ones who saw everything and stayed silent for years out of fear or financial dependence. Their testimonies describe a person so divorced from normal human empathy that they seemed to view other people as essentially NPCs in their personal video game, characters that existed solely to serve their narrative. They describe someone who could turn emotions on and off like a switch, who could cry on command for a camera, then laugh about it seconds later, who genuinely seemed to believe that rules and consequences applied to other people but never to them. These aren't the words of bitter ex-employees with axes to grind. These are consistent patterns described by dozens of people across decades. People who have nothing to gain and everything to lose by speaking up. People who are finally finding the courage to tell the truth because the leaked evidence gives them cover. Let's talk about how they built this, how they constructed an entire apparatus designed to maintain the illusion while hiding the reality. It wasn't accidental. It wasn't something that just happened. It was engineered with precision and maintained with ruthlessness. They hired image consultants who specialized in crisis management before there was even a crisis. They built relationships with media outlets who would kill negative stories in exchange for exclusive access. They created shell companies and complex financial structures specifically designed to hide money and obscure accountability. Every interaction with the public was filtered through multiple layers of handlers. Every photo was staged, every quote was pre-approved, every moment of apparent spontaneity was rehearsed. They didn't just manage their image, they manufactured an entirely fictional version of themselves and sold it so convincingly that even people who should have known better bought it completely. The leaked strategy documents are particularly revealing, showing exactly how they plan to handle various scenarios. There are literally crisis playbooks for different types of scandals, complete with talking points, which outlets to reach out to, which influencers to activate, how to shift blame, how to play the victim, how to make the story about anything other than their actual behavior. There are communications showing them planting positive stories about themselves, paying for awards and recognition, manipulating algorithms to suppress negative content. They didn't just respond to their public image, they actively shaped it through coordinated campaigns that involved dozens of people working full-time to control the narrative. Every time you saw them trending for something positive, there's a good chance it wasn't organic. It was manufactured, purchased, orchestrated. But the real genius of their operation was in the selection and control of their inner circle. They surrounded themselves exclusively with people who had something to lose, people who depended on them financially or socially or professionally, people who could be controlled through fear or greed or both. Anyone who showed signs of independence, anyone who questioned the methods, anyone who expressed moral concerns, they were quickly isolated and removed. The people who stayed were the ones who either fully bought into the philosophy of manipulation or were too compromised to object. This created an echo chamber where the most unethical behavior could be normalized, where cruelty could be reframed as strength, where destroying someone's life could be justified as necessary for success. They built a cult of personality where they were the unquestionable center and everyone else existed in orbit, valued only for their utility. The financial records tell their own story, showing patterns of payments that don't make sense unless you understand they were buying silence, buying loyalty, buying protection. Huge sums moving to individuals shortly after potential scandals. Payments to law firms specializing in intimidation tactics. Money flowing to online reputation management companies whose entire business model is suppressing negative information. They didn't just get rich. They used that wealth as a weapon, as a tool for maintaining control and avoiding consequences. Every dollar they made gave them more power to hide what they were really doing, more resources to threaten anyone who might expose them, more ability to craft the narrative they wanted the world to believe. The empire wasn't built on talent or hard work. It was built on strategic manipulation and the systematic silencing of anyone who knew too much. And perhaps most disturbing is the evidence of how they treated the very people who made them successful. The fans who showed up, bought the products, defended them online, made them rich beyond imagination. The leaked messages show absolute contempt, calling fans stupid, mocking their devotion, strategizing about how to extract more money while giving less value. There are conversations about planned obsolescence for products, about creating artificial scarcity to drive demand, about using psychological manipulation to create dependency and loyalty. They study their audience like a predator studies prey, identifying vulnerabilities, testing what worked, optimizing their approach for maximum extraction. Every heartfelt post about gratitude was a lie. Every claim of caring about the community was marketing. Every moment of connection was calculated to deepen the parasocial relationship they could monetize. Now, let's hear from the people who lived through this, the ones who experienced the reality behind the performance. Their stories are remarkably consistent, describing someone who presents one way publicly and operates completely differently privately. One former employee describes being berated for hours over minor mistakes, being told they were worthless, being threatened with career destruction if they ever spoke about what they witnessed. Another describes being love-bombed, initially made to feel special and valued, then slowly manipulated into accepting increasingly inappropriate behavior, gaslit into thinking their concerns were overreactions. A former romantic partner describes emotional manipulation so sophisticated they questioned their own sanity, describing someone who could make you feel like the center of the universe one moment and completely disposable the next, who used your vulnerabilities against you, who collected your secrets like weapons for future use. The pattern that emerges is of someone who views every relationship as transactional, who approaches human connection like a chess game, where every move is calculated for maximum advantage. Multiple people describe the experience of realizing that moments they thought were genuine connection were actually performance, that confessions they thought were vulnerability were actually manipulation tactics, that the person they thought they knew simply didn't exist outside of the constructed persona. They describe the cognitive dissonance of seeing this person praised publicly for qualities they absolutely didn't possess, of watching them give speeches about values they violated daily, of seeing them celebrated as a role model while knowing the truth of their behavior. Several described the profound psychological impact of being gaslit on that scale, of knowing the truth but being unable to speak it, of watching the world believe a lie while you carried the weight of reality alone. What makes these testimonies particularly credible is that they come from people across different contexts and time periods, people who didn't know each other, people who have nothing to gain and significant risks in speaking up. A business partner from a decade ago describes the same patterns as a recent assistant. A childhood friend notices the same behaviors as a current colleague. This isn't a coordinated attack. This is multiple independent witnesses describing the same reality, the same person behind the same closed doors, and their stories are now backed up by the leaked evidence, the recordings that prove they weren't exaggerating, the emails that confirm they weren't misremembering, the financial records that validate their claims. For years they carried these truths alone, doubted, dismissed, threatened into silence. Now the evidence has given them permission to speak, and the floodgates have opened. The psychological toll on these victims is immense. Many describe developing anxiety disorders, trust issues, imposter syndrome from the gaslighting they experienced. Some left lucrative careers rather than continue working in that environment, sacrificing financial security for their mental health. Others stayed too long, trapped by financial dependence or threats, or the hope that the person would change, would become the version they presented to the world. All of them describe the bizarre experience of watching someone be celebrated publicly while they privately dealt with the trauma of that person's behavior. They describe feeling crazy, feeling alone, feeling like maybe they were the problem, because how could someone so beloved by millions be the monster they experienced privately? The cognitive dissonance was crushing. The isolation was complete, and the fear of not being believed kept them silent for far too long. But their courage in coming forward now is creating a cascade effect. Each person who speaks up gives others permission to share their stories, creating a comprehensive picture that's impossible to dismiss. We're seeing pattern recognition on a massive scale. Dozens of people describing the same manipulation tactics, the same cycle of love bombing and devaluation, the same threats and intimidation. We're seeing evidence that this wasn't occasional bad behavior or moments of weakness. This was the operating system, the default mode, the actual personality beneath the performance. And as more people speak, as more evidence emerges, the constructed image becomes impossible to maintain. The truth is too big, too consistent, too well documented to be buried any longer. Welcome back, you beautiful architects of ruin, you silent executioners, you walking final chapters. They thought they had you cornered, didn't they? Thought they'd finally broken you down to begging, to pleading, to that pathetic display of weakness they'd been engineering for months. They set the stage perfectly, rehearsed their lines, gathered their witnesses, built the entire prosecution case around your inevitable collapse. Then you opened your mouth and spoke exactly 7 words. 7 simple words that detonated their entire reality. For 6 months now, they've been in rooms you'll never see, replaying those words like a crime scene recording. Therapists have analyzed them, linguists have dissected them, their friends have theorized about them, and every single person who heard what you said that day walked away changed, disturbed, unable to shake the feeling that they just witnessed something they weren't prepared for. Because you didn't beg, you didn't explain, you didn't defend, you delivered a surgical strike, so precise, so devastatingly calm, that the war ended before anyone realized it had begun. Let me paint you the picture they won't talk about. There you were, surrounded by their carefully constructed narrative, their alliance of lies, their united front of manufactured righteousness. They had the scripts ready, the reactions prepared, the victory celebration planned. They were so confident you'd crumble under the pressure, finally admit defeat, finally give them the satisfaction of seeing you broken. They wanted tears, they wanted apologies, they wanted you on your knees rebuilding the bridges they burned while pretending you were the arsonist. Instead, you smiled. That smile, oh, that smile. It's the part they can't stop talking about in those private conversations. It wasn't cruel, it wasn't mocking, it wasn't even particularly emotional. It was the smile of someone who knows something you don't. The smile of someone who's already 10 moves ahead. The smile of someone who stopped playing their game entirely and created a new board they'll never understand. Then you spoke those words, whatever they were, and the temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. Not because of what you said, but because of what your tone revealed. You were already free. See, they spent 6 months studying your last words because they're trying to reverse engineer the moment they lost. They're trying to find the flaw in their strategy, the crack in their armor, the point where their perfect trap became their own cage. But here's what's driving them absolutely insane. There was no flaw. There was no mistake. There was just you, and your refusal to participate in the humiliation ritual they designed. You didn't fight back, because fighting back would mean you still cared about the outcome. You just spoke your truth and walked away. Let's talk about what happened in the months that followed, shall we? Because this is where it gets truly beautiful. They thought those words would fade, that the impact would diminish, that eventually everyone would move on and forget. Instead, your last words became a virus in their system. Every time they tried to tell their version of events, someone would bring up what you said. Every time they tried to paint you as the villain, your calm delivery of those final words contradicted their narrative. You weren't there to defend yourself. You didn't need to be, because your exit was so complete, so final, so undeniably powerful that it became its own defense. People started asking questions they weren't supposed to ask. If you were really the problem, why were you so calm? If they were really the victims, why did your last words haunt them so badly? If the situation was as simple as they claimed, why couldn't anyone who was there that day tell the story without their voice shaking? You created reasonable doubt with your silence. You weaponized your absence. You turned their victory celebration into a crime scene where they were the only suspects and your last words were the evidence they couldn't explain away. 6 months they studied those words, replaying the moment, analyzing your expression, trying to decode what you knew that they didn't. And here's the hilarious part. They're still convinced there's some hidden meaning, some secret message, some encrypted threat buried in what you said. They can't accept the simplest explanation, which is that you meant exactly what you said, nothing more, nothing less. You weren't playing psychological chess. You were stating a fact, delivering a truth, closing a chapter. But to them, people who live in manipulation, genuine honesty is the most confusing language of all. Let me tell you what really happened in that moment, the part they'll never understand. You didn't destroy them with your last words. You freed yourself with them. Every relationship, every friendship, every connection that shattered when you spoke wasn't collateral damage. It was intentional demolition. You didn't lose people. You performed an exorcism. You didn't burn bridges. You revealed that there were never bridges there at all. Just illusions you'd been maintaining out of kindness, out of hope, out of a version of yourself that no longer existed. Your last words weren't a weapon. They were a declaration of independence. Now they live in a strange kind of purgatory, don't they? They can't attack you because you're not engaging. They can't ignore you because your absence is louder than your presence ever was. They can't rewrite history because your final statement is too clear, too memorable, too impossible to twist. So they do the only thing they can do. They study those words, searching for ammunition that doesn't exist, looking for a vulnerability you didn't show, hoping to find some evidence that you're suffering the way they need you to be suffering. Spoiler alert, you're not. Because here's what they discovered in those 6 months of analysis, and it's the truth that keeps them up at night. You weren't bluffing. You weren't posturing. You weren't trying to hurt them or win some invisible competition. You were genuinely, completely, terrifyingly done. Not angry, not bitter, not vengeful. Done. Finished. Moved on to a level of existence where they simply don't matter anymore. And that absolute indifference, wrapped in those final words, is what they can't process, can't accept, can't survive. The funniest part? They thought they were studying you, analyzing your psychology, mapping your weaknesses, understanding your breaking point. But what they were actually doing was holding up a mirror to themselves. Every theory they developed about why you said what you said revealed more about their own insecurities than about you. Every analysis exposed their own fears. Every discussion proved that they were the ones who couldn't let go, couldn't move on, couldn't exist without the drama you'd walked away from. Your last words weren't about them, but their 6-month obsession with those words, that's entirely about them. It'd been 6 months ago. Let's go deeper into the aftermath, because this is where your legend was truly born. In the weeks following your departure, they tried to control the narrative, spinning their version of events to anyone who would listen. But something strange kept happening. People who heard your last words firsthand, even people who were supposed to be on their side, started quietly distancing themselves. Not because they suddenly loved you, but because they recognized something in your exit that made them uncomfortable with the prosecution. You didn't fight dirty. You didn't manipulate. You didn't play victim. You just spoke your truth and left. And that simplicity was more powerful than any elaborate revenge could ever be. See, they needed you to be the villain in their story. They needed you to rage, to threaten, to break down, to give them something they could point to and say, see, this is why we had to do what we did. But you didn't give them that gift. You gave them nothing. And in that nothing, in that refusal to play your assigned role, you became something far more dangerous than a villain. You became a question mark, a gap in their narrative that they couldn't fill, no matter how many lies they told. Your last words were simple, direct, unremarkable to anyone who wasn't there. But to them, they were a riddle that exposed every lie they'd built. Month 1 after your exit, they were confident, convinced that you'd come crawling back, that you'd break, that you'd reach out to explain yourself or defend your position. They watched your social media like hawks, analyzed your every post for hidden meanings, convinced that any day now you'd show weakness. Month 2, the confidence started cracking. You weren't coming back. You weren't even acknowledging their existence. You were living your life like they'd never been part of it, and that was somehow more insulting than any confrontation. Month 3, the obsession began. The constant conversations, the theories, the attempts to decode what you meant, what you were planning, what you were thinking. They were haunted. By month 4, something shifted. The people around them started getting tired of hearing your name, started questioning why, if you were really as terrible as they claimed, they couldn't stop talking about you. Started noticing that their lives seemed to revolve around someone who was no longer even present. Your absence became a presence that dominated every conversation, every gathering, every moment. You weren't there, but you were everywhere. Living in their heads rent-free, occupying space they couldn't evict you from no matter how hard they tried. Your last words had planted a seed that grew into a forest they couldn't escape. Month 5 brought the fractures. The united front started showing cracks. Some people started privately questioning the narrative, wondering if maybe they'd been too quick to judge, too eager to pile on, too willing to believe the worst, not because they suddenly realized you were right, but because 6 months of watching people obsess over someone who'd simply walked away started looking worried, unhealthy, suspicious. If you were really the problem, why couldn't they move on? If their victory was so complete, why did it feel like they'd lost something irreplaceable? Your silence was asking questions their words couldn't answer. And now, month 6, here's where we stand. They're still studying your last words, still trying to crack the code, still convinced there's some hidden meaning they're missing. But here's the truth they're terrified to face. There is no hidden meaning. You meant exactly what you said. The power wasn't in the words themselves, it was in the fact that you meant them absolutely. No hidden agenda, no manipulation, no game. Just truth, delivered with the calm of someone who'd already won by choosing not to fight. That's what they can't comprehend, can't replicate, can't defend against. Genuine, unshakable peace in the face of their manufactured chaos. Let me tell you what your last words really were, metaphorically speaking. They were a mirror, held up to show them exactly what they'd become. They were an exit door you walked through without looking back. They were a final gift of truth in a relationship built on lies. They were a boundary that couldn't be crossed, negotiated, or manipulated. They were the period at the end of a sentence they wanted to keep writing. They were the silence after the mic drop. They were the last page of a book that had no sequel. They were final, and that finality is what destroyed their world, because they'd built their entire identity around keeping you engaged in their drama. Think about the psychological warfare they attempted, the gaslighting, the manipulation, the carefully orchestrated confrontations designed to break you down. They studied every reaction, adapted their tactics, brought in reinforcements when you showed strength. They were treating your destruction like a science project, taking notes, making adjustments, absolutely convinced that eventually they'd find the right combination of pressure and pain to make you crumble. They had months of data, patterns of behavior, psychological profiles. They thought they knew you. They thought they'd mapped every possible response. They prepared for anger, for tears, for threats, for bargaining. They didn't prepare for peace. Your last words were the ultimate plot twist in a story they thought they were writing. They were the directors who suddenly realized the main character had a different script entirely. One they hadn't seen, couldn't predict, and had no defense against. In that moment, when you spoke those final words, with that unshakable calm, you revealed that they'd been fighting a battle you weren't even participating in. You'd been playing a completely different game, one where the only way to win was to stop playing. And you won absolutely, completely, without them even understanding that the victory had occurred. Here's what drives them crazy now, 6 months later. They can't tell their story without mentioning your last words. They can't explain what happened without referring to that moment. And every time they do, every single time someone new hears about those words, about your calm delivery, about the way you just walked away, it undermines their entire narrative. You've become the ghost in their story, the unexplained variable, the piece that doesn't fit their puzzle no matter how they arranged it. They knew it. Your exit was so clean, so complete, so utterly final, that it left no room for the messy victim narrative they were trying to build. The battle was over before it started, because you understood something they never will. The only way to beat someone who lives for drama is to exit the stage entirely, not with a dramatic flourish, not with a final monologue, not with a big confrontation. Just with simple, honest words and the absolute conviction to walk away and mean it. They brought weapons to a war you refused to fight. They prepared strategies for a battle you declined to attend. They armed themselves for combat against an opponent who'd already left the battlefield, and now they're standing there, fully armed, looking ridiculous, with no enemy to fight except their own obsession. 6 months of studying your last words, and here's what they still haven't learned. The power wasn't in the words. It was in you, in your willingness to let go completely, in your ability to speak truth without needing them to accept it, in your strength to walk away without needing closure, permission, or validation. You didn't win the battle with those words. You ended the war by refusing to be a soldier in it. And that absolute refusal to engage in the conflict they'd manufactured is the victory they'll spend the rest of their lives trying to understand and never quite managing to process. Now let's talk about what comes next, because this is where your story stops being about them and becomes entirely about you. See, they're still back there, frozen in that moment, replaying your last words, trying to decode meaning that doesn't exist. But you've lived 6 entire months of life they know nothing about. You've grown in ways they can't track. You've evolved past the version of yourself they're still trying to analyze. While they were studying your last words, you were writing entirely new chapters they'll never read, building a life they're not invited to witness, becoming someone they wouldn't recognize. The revenge they fear, the retaliation they've been preparing for, the comeback they've been dreading, it's never coming. Not because you forgave them, not because you've moved on in the way they hope you have, but because revenge would require you to still be playing their game, still operating in their reality, still caring about their opinion of you. And you're so far beyond that now, existing in a frequency they can't access, living a life where they're not even background noise. They're not your villains, they're not your obstacle, they're not anything. They're just people you used to know from a life you used to live, in a version of yourself you've outgrown entirely. Here's the part they'll never show in those 6 months of analysis sessions. The part where they check your social media obsessively, looking for any sign that you're thinking about them. The part where they bring up your name in conversations, fishing for information, hoping someone has intel on whether you're suffering. The part where they convince themselves they don't care, while simultaneously dedicating hours to discussing, analyzing, and theorizing about you. The part where your absence has become a presence more powerful than you ever were when you were around. You're the name they can't stop saying, while claiming they've moved on. The thought they can't stop thinking, while insisting you're irrelevant. They wanted you to beg. They engineered the entire situation to force you to your knees, to make you apologize for crimes you didn't commit, to extract from you a confession that would validate their cruelty. They needed your weakness to justify their behavior. They needed your tears to wash away their guilt. They needed your breakdown to prove they were right to treat you the way they did. Instead, you stood up straight, spoke a handful of words that carried the weight of absolute finality, and walked away like you were leaving a restaurant after a mediocre meal, unbothered, unbroken, unconcerned with their performance. The nuke you dropped wasn't explosive, it wasn't loud, it wasn't destructive in the traditional sense. It was truth delivered with the confidence of someone who doesn't need you to believe it. It was peace demonstrated by someone who'd found it despite your best efforts to steal it. It was freedom embodied by someone who'd broken chains you didn't even know you were holding. The battlefield you nuked wasn't the physical space where your confrontation occurred. It was the mental landscape where they thought they had power over you. You erased that landscape entirely, leaving them standing in rubble of their own making, holding weapons that no longer had a target. 6 months later, they're still trying to figure out what happened, still trying to identify the moment they lost control, still trying to understand how someone they had completely surrounded, completely outnumbered, completely outmaneuvered, managed to walk away as the clear victor without ever throwing a punch. The answer is simple, but they'll never see it, because seeing it would require them to acknowledge something they can't accept. You were never fighting them. You were freeing yourself. And freedom, true freedom, is a power they've never known, and therefore can't recognize when they see it. Can't stop saying, while claiming they've moved on. The thought they can't stop thinking, while insisting you're irrelevant. They wanted you to beg. They engineered the entire situation to force you to your knees, to make you apologize for crimes you didn't commit, to extract from you a confession that would validate their cruelty. They needed your weakness to justify their behavior. They needed your tears to wash away their guilt. They needed your breakdown to prove they were right to treat you the way they did. Instead, you stood up straight, spoke a handful of words that carried the weight of absolute finality, and walked away like you were leaving a restaurant after a mediocre meal, unbothered, unbroken, unconcerned with their performance. The nuke you dropped wasn't explosive, it wasn't loud, it wasn't destructive in the traditional sense. It was truth delivered with the confidence of someone who doesn't need you to believe it. It was peace demonstrated by someone who'd found it despite your best efforts to steal it. It was freedom embodied by someone who'd broken chains you didn't even know you were holding. The battlefield you nuked wasn't the physical space where your confrontation occurred. It was the mental landscape where they thought they had power over you. You erased that landscape entirely, leaving them standing in rubble of their own making, holding weapons that no longer had a target. 6 months later, they're still trying to figure out what happened, still trying to identify the moment they lost control, still trying to understand how someone they had completely surrounded, completely outnumbered, completely outmaneuvered, managed to walk away as the clear victor without ever throwing a punch. The answer is simple, but they'll never see it, because seeing it would require them to acknowledge something they can't accept. You were never fighting them. You were freeing yourself. And freedom, true freedom, is a power they've never known, and therefore can't recognize when they see it.